We're now going to talk about the presidents that served during the 1920s, Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. You'll notice that there is another link in the title. That links you to the video series The Presidents from the History Channel, and it takes you through the end of World War I all the way to 1945. So please feel free to click on that and get some further information on these two presidents. But we're going to start with Warren G. Harding. He was President of the United States from 1921 to 1923. He ran on the idea of this return to normalcy. That was his motto for his presidency. He wanted things, especially after, we have just gotten out of World War I. He's starting a new decade, and he wanted to keep things kind of quiet and calm. He was a very savvy politician. He was sociable and gregarious. He was definitely the epitome of a politician in the sense of when we think of a politician, shaking hands, kissing babies. That was Warren G. Harding. He knew he did not know everything. Therefore, he surrounded himself with, quote unquote, the best minds to fill out his cabinet. Remember that a president's cabinet is essentially his advisors. So being that he knew that there was no way he could possibly know everything about everything, he wanted to surround himself with the best possible advisors, and that he did. Throughout his term, he did what his motto said. He returned the country to normalcy. He did keep things relatively quiet and calm. He was the first president to require that a president has to declare a budget to Congress, and he instituted that. But during his presidency, things kept pretty normal. In 1923, he was on a train trip west. He was actually headed out to Alaska. Unfortunately had some failing health and stopped in San Francisco to recuperate. There he had a heart attack and ended up dying in office. About a year after his death, and this is what becomes kind of interesting and sad at the same time about Warren Harding, is that some scandals came to light. What came to light was that his Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall, he leased naval oil reserves in California and Teapot Dome in Wyoming to rich oil businessmen. And he did this in exchange for illegal kickbacks. Basically, he was getting money in return for giving them these oil reserves. Now, question still remains whether Harding really knew about this or not, but whether he did or did not know, he certainly got criticism for it. And that scandal is known as the Teapot Dome scandal. And I know that we have talked a little bit about that in class. But these scandals, then there were a couple other books that came out that kind of challenged the reputation of Harding. But it's these scandals that people know about Harding, so it kind of diminished his presidency. Okay, so we're now going to talk about Calvin Coolidge, and what you might find interesting about him is that he was a governor of Massachusetts. He served as president from 1923 to 1929. His nickname, if you will, was called Silent Cal. He was kind of contrary to Warren G. Harding in the sense that he was a man of few words. He didn't say a whole lot. But throughout his presidency, he did have a tight rein on the budget. He had the goal of keeping government small and to keep businesses booming. He obviously presided over most of the 20s, where we saw a period of prosperity. People were getting wealthy and they were investing, and it was a time of prosperity. But unfortunately, Coolidge missed some signs of economic instability. He relied very heavily on his cabinet, or on his advisors, as we mentioned before. His Secretary of the Treasury was a man named Andrew Mellon. He was the third richest man in the country, and being the third richest man in the country, no recession or depression would ever touch him. So he was a little bit out of touch with the economic situation that was occurring. And Coolidge really relied too heavily on him. We know that his presidency ended in 1929, and what also happened in 1929 was the stock market crash, which ended up was one of the factors that led to the Great Depression. So the events during Calvin Coolidge's presidency really set the stage for this stock market crash and eventually the Great Depression. Certainly that was not his intent, and the 20s were a time of prosperity, but you have to be mindful of economic situations in the country, and he missed those signs of economic instability and therefore could not change it in time to save the country from what would eventually become the Great Depression. So now we're going to talk about the Scopes trial. Formally, it was known as the State of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes. Informally, it was known as the Scopes Monkey trial. In 1925, a substitute high school teacher, John T. Scopes, was accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act. Now, what the Butler Act said was that basically it was unlawful to teach human evolution in science classes to any state-funded school, or what we would know as a public school. This drew national attention, basically because you had this idea of the fundamentalists, which are basically traditionalists, who said that that the idea of creationism, as it is revealed in the Bible, took priority over all human knowledge. So it disregarded science altogether. So this idea of the fundamentalists was that creation should be taught in schools. Then, being the 1920s, you have these modernists who basically said that we have to look at science, that we have to look at this idea of evolution and present both ideas, both creation and evolution. What we see is that Scopes was ended up being found guilty and fined $100 in 1925. That is equivalent to $1,395 in 2017. The reason why it drew such national attention was primarily because you had big-time lawyers who got involved with this case. You had William Jennings Bryan, who was a 3-time presidential candidate. He argued for the prosecution, and you had Clarence Darrow, who was a very famed defense attorney, and he spoke for Scopes. So having these two high-profile lawyers involved in this case really drew some national attention. But it was the first time we really see the idea of this idea of the teaching of creation versus evolution. And what we start to talk about in public schools at this time is the separation of church and state. So removing the elements of the church out of a public school system. The idea of creationism is an idea of the church, and evolution is a more science-based theory, and one that has drawn great attention. So we first see that kind of idea of separation of church and state within public schools during this Scopes trial. And again, it received national notoriety simply because of the high-profile lawyers that took this case, and that is the Scopes trial. So we're going to talk about the culture of 1920s, and we're going to start with the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. Known as Prohibition, the 18th Amendment banned the sale and the drinking of alcohol in the United States. It took effect in 1919 and ultimately was a huge failure. The 18th Amendment is the only amendment to be repealed, and it was repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. After the 18th Amendment was instituted, Congress passed what was called the Volstead Act, which set the date for Prohibition to begin, and that was January 17, 1920. The Act also defines strict limits on beverages containing alcohol, ensuring that the alcohol would be no more than 0.5%. We know that Prohibition was very difficult to enforce. Despite the passage of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Acts, there was an increase in the illegal production and the sale of liquor, and this was known as bootlegging. There were also illegal drinking establishments that were set up, and those were called speakeasies. There was also an increase of gang violence and organized crime surrounding the sale and drinking of alcohol. And for these reasons, specifically for the violence, that ended up support ended up waning for Prohibition by the end of the 1920s. In early 1933, Congress adopted a resolution proposing a 21st Amendment to the Constitution that would repeal the 18th. It was ratified by the end of 1933, and that was the 21st Amendment was the thing that brought Prohibition to a close. What we see in the 1920s, and we mentioned this a few minutes ago, was this idea of traditionalism versus modernism. What we see in traditionalism is the belief that it is usually best to keep things the way they are. Traditionalists in the 20s lived in rural areas and favored religion over science, just as we discussed with that Scopes trial. They certainly believed in creationism over evolution. They favored Prohibition and found jazz and flapper culture distasteful, and they viewed material culture and the new technology as damaging to society. Conversely, we have the idea of modernism, the belief that it is often best to try new ways of doing things. So when we see modernists in the 1920s, we see that they lived in mostly urban areas and favored science over religion. So that's where we see the idea of evolution versus creationism. They disliked Prohibition and found jazz and the flapper culture exciting. And they saw a material culture and new technology as something that represented progress. So we see in the 1920s these two ideals really conflicting with one another. This idea of traditionalism, of keeping the way things are, versus modernism, which is to try new ways of doing things. So we do see a clash in culture starting in the 1920s. So when we look at the modern woman in the 1920s, what we see are flappers. We all know what they look like, the bobbed haircuts and the shorter skirts and the heels and the pearls and so forth. But flappers were mainly living in the north, in cities. They were single, young, middle-class women. Many held steady jobs, but at night, that was how they lived during the day, but at night they were engaged in an active city nightlife. They went to jazz clubs and vaudeville shows. They went to speakeasies, and they adopted a carefree attitude toward Prohibition, just as their male counterparts would. Books like The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald gave the public a view of society that was much different than what they were used to. It gives this idea of glamour and excitement, and that they did not necessarily have before. So we do see that transition into the 20s as a more exciting time, especially for women. As we just mentioned, organized crime was a byproduct of the Prohibition, and one of the reasons why it went out of favor with most Americans and why it needed repeal. But Al Capone became one of the most famous or most celebrated gangsters of the time. He was into the illegal sale of alcohol, and eventually was arrested and sentenced to 11 years in prison, where he eventually died in prison. However, he was not imprisoned for his dealings during Prohibition, but rather tax evasion, which is kind of interesting. But Al Capone was a major figure in organized crime during the time of the 1920s, and one of the main reasons why Prohibition was repealed under the 21st Amendment.